everyone, and welcome to our lecture representing the divine, late antique Jewish art and ritual. I am Professor Leslie Keel. I teach history here at Porterville College, and I'm going to come over here. I am the coordinator of Chap. The Porterville College Cultural and Historical Awareness Program, Chap, was organized in 2002 to enhance students' awareness of certain important aspects of our society to which they may previously have had little to no exposure. A theme is chosen by CHAP members each school year, and faculty members across campus are encouraged to integrate elements of that theme into their coursework. By subtly saturating students with information about the chosen topic throughout the year, the awareness of the entire campus community is elevated. Our theme for the next 2 years, fall 2024 to spring 2026, was voted on by over 200 students last year. That theme is Don't Stop Believing, all things belief systems, spirituality, religion, and secular humanism. We will be exploring the different ways humans have answered and wrestled with the big questions: who are we? Why are we here? I hope you will join us at upcoming CHAP events during the spring semester, ranging on topics from near-death experiences to preaching in prisons. A tentative schedule will be handed out at the end of tonight's event. I want to quickly thank our maintenance staff, CHAP committee, Roger Perez, Daisy Rodriguez, and President Monterez for all their work and support in making these events possible. Our speaker today is Rachel Schmid. Rachel Schmid is an independent art historian and curator living and working in Los Angeles. Previously, she worked for 9 years at California Lutheran University as curator of the William Rowland Gallery of Fine Art and the Quan Fong Gallery of Art and Culture, where she helmed the permanent collection and taught courses on arts, management, and museum studies. She received a BA from UCLA in art history and completed her MA in art history at the University of Notre Dame, where she reevaluated ancient synagogue mosaics through the lens of popular magic culture, astronomy, liturgy, poetry, and agricultural practices of the 4th and 6th century Levant. She is currently a cultural studies doctoral student at Claremont Graduate University, where her research considers museum visitorship, trends, and constructions of power dynamics. 2 quick disclaimers. First, figurative images of gods will be displayed during our presentation tonight. And second, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views of Porterville College or its affiliates. Once Rachel is done speaking, we will open up for questions from the audience. Our event tonight will end at roughly 8 p.m. Once the event is over, I will have proof of attendance cards for those who need one. And with that, please give a warm welcome to Rachel Schmid.
Thank you so much. I will just double check if you prefer. Do you prefer that I stand, that I sit? How will you have me? Seated or standing?
What's comfortable? Standing there.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you guys so much. Thank you also to, everyone who came here, and also to Leslie, Debbie, and Duran for inviting me. This is so nice to get to share this research with you. When I wrote my master's thesis, when I published it over 10 years ago, it was a really exciting time in the field. And I remember very specifically, right after it published, I told my partner, I can't wait for the next synagogue to be discovered, and it will make all of my work up till this point irrelevant. Years and years worth of work. Because that's exactly what's happening, is that these synagogues, they just keep coming up, and we keep finding them and finding them. And this was especially poignant when I was finishing up this work. What had happened was only about 100 years ago, in the 1920s, was when our idea of Jewish art, Jewish visual culture, radically changed. Because before that, we had always felt, known, understood Jewish art to be aniconic, meaning that it didn't have any figurative images. We understood the works to be aniconic, so not having figurative images, not having people in any of the images, because that's all that we had found, that's all we knew, and we had forgotten anything that came before that. And then starting in the 1920s and 30s, all of these archaeological digs brought up these amazing synagogues. And these amazing synagogues with people, with animals, with images, and also really weird stuff that we didn't expect, really un-Jewish ideas. Things like having Helios at the center, or having a zodiac mosaic in the center of a synagogue floor. So, like I said, just 100 years ago, up until 93, we started finding all of these synagogues, and then yes, since I published, another one was discovered at Hukok by Jody Magnus. So all of these wonderful things keep coming up. So, I will say that we're looking at synagogues that are going to be mostly in northern Israel up here. I'll mention a few that are down here, but mostly we want to focus up here around the Sea of Galilee. And of these, hundreds of synagogues had been found. We have just 8 of them that have the zodiac mosaic in them, that have Helios at the center. But this is really, really interesting iconography. And so I'm going to focus today on just the ones mostly that have this mosaic, that have this god Helios at the center. I'm also really interested in magic and ritual practices. I'm interested in the use of iconography. And I'm interested in how Jews were differentiating themselves during this late antique period. So this is a period where the Roman Empire is declining, where Christianity is on the rise. We haven't yet come to Islam conquest in the area, but you have Judaism that is competing in the same area right next to it with polytheistic temples and also with Christian churches, and people are living amongst each other. So it's really interesting to see, how do Jews identify? What is their visual culture that sets them apart from the other people in their area? So I'm going to start a little bit before I get to the synagogues with Bet She'arim. And this is a necropolis, which means this is where we put a bunch of dead people in here. It's these stone-carved caves, these caverns. And it can be blazing hot outside, but you go inside and it's just super cold and chilly. And you have these carved, let me see, just keep the mouse out of the way. We have these carved sarcophagi that, at one point did hold bodies in them. And that's where we start to see some images. We don't have very many figurative images in here. We have a lot of graffiti that have a couple figurative pieces, but we do have a lot of stone carvings. So before we discovered or rediscovered the synagogues, this was kind of our idea of what Jewish art looked like. And so you'll see, for instance, the menorah. So this is the 6-branch candelabra that has one in the center, and this was associated with the temple, temple with a capital T. So the second temple, the main temple. And this was really the symbol for Jews during this period. And a lot of times we think of the Magen David or the Star of David as the symbol for Judaism, for Jewish people, but that's actually a very recent modern development. So actually, for millennia, this was the symbol that was used. And this was something that was different from any other culture that was in the area. So something that was just Jewish. Something that had been requested in the Bible to be put in there, even down to how it should be decorated, how the stand should look like. So we have several examples at Bet She'arim of the menorah, which, by the way, not to be confused with the one that we use on Hanukkah. That's a Hanukkah. Also a lamp. Menorah just means lamp. Like, you go to IKEA and you can literally just get a menorah. It's just a lamp. But the one that we use for Hanukkah has the extra little candelabra legs, because those are the ones that represent the 8 nights where the oil lasted. So, but back to the images. We do have a few images and a few, what we could consider figurative. There, some animal instances like that are out of stone carvings that are in Bet She'arim. And one topic I'll be going over often tonight is angels and the worship, or maybe celebration, the integration of angels into daily life. And so we're very tempted to try to find instances where we can say, this is what the angel looks like in Jewish culture. But we can't, or at least not in this instance, because This one is often identified as a Nike. So this one is compared next to it with a polytheist image of a carved relief of a Nike where, what we think of as a winged victory, or where the Nike swoosh came from. And it's interesting to see how that image evolved. So we identify it as a Nike because it has that laurel wreath with it. But then if we look at, not very far into the future, some Christian examples where they take that same iconography, but they make it into their own. So we have on the top left is the Jewish one, and then on the top right is the polytheist version. So both of those are the winged victory Nike. And then the one on the bottom, though, suddenly it becomes an angel. And so there's that interesting period in between of how do we take this iconography and shape it to our needs. So we'll get to the first synagogue that was discovered that completely blew our minds about what the interior of synagogues could be like. This one doesn't have the stone mosaics, but you can see the images are just floor to ceiling. It's incredible what this has. And in this case, this is in the diaspora, so this is in Syria, called Dura Europos, and you can actually see the slant. So there were even more images in here than what is available here. What had happened was there was an invasion, and this synagogue, along with a church and another temple, were all along the same street. And that street faced the wall where the city was. And so in order to try to protect the city from the invaders, they just pushed as much as they could up against this wall, because that wall was the wall of the city, and buried it. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and after the city was conquered and destroyed, it was never re-inhabited. But because it was never re-inhabited, eventually, when it was dug up, that's when we were able to find all of these images. And this is where we get some of those first narrative looks of how Jews understood some of the stories, like, for instance, the story of Moses, how they were depicted. And in this case, because most of the buildings along that retaining wall still exist, we can actually compare it to the Christian church. And we can see that they probably used the same artists, the same artisans who were creating the depictions. So this would have been a very localized style. And that's probably why we haven't found anything like it that's very similar. But here's another image. Again, stories that would be very familiar. You'll see there's no labels on any of them. It was just expected that the congregation would know exactly what stories were being depicted. And this is also the first time that we start to see the solidification on the top of the iconography that is going to be associated specifically with Jewish synagogues, with Jewish people. So on the left, you see the menorah again, that candelabra. And that's going to be now throughout. You can see it's very specifically designed, in accordance with what the biblical texts say it should be. The way it looks, it's supposed to have flower blossoms along the candelabra arms, how it's on 3 legs. And then next to it, we have the lulav and the etrog. So these are implements that were only used in Jewish tradition for the holiday called Sukkot. So again, you can see that they're looking for instances of something that cannot be used by another culture. There isn't anything polytheistic where they can say, oh, we're going to use a lulav or an etrog, or anything either in Christianity. And particularly because at this point, when Christianity is on the rise, it's becoming the official religion of the empire. Now that that's happening, you have Christianity using a lot of the same symbols, a lot of the same narrative, a lot of the same biblical stories that are going to illustrate their churches, and they're using that as a seed. They're saying, look at our legacy, look at our lineage. We are using these Old Testament stories. And actually, a lot of times, like in their early catacombs, they were using 4 times as many stories from the Old Testament than the New Testament. So they were really weighing heavy on those up until that point had been Jewish imagery. And so moving from left to right, so then in the center we also have, in this case it's probably a depiction of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies that would have been in the second temple. In other spaces, we're not sure, it could just be representing the apse in other synagogues of where the Torah shrine was contained. So at this period, especially for practicing Jews, the Torah was very, very holy. It was very sacred. Words were very sacred. Sounds were very sacred. All of it relating to the Hebrew language and the Hebrew texts. So this is the apse where actually it would have been kept, where the Torah scrolls would have been kept. So this was the holiest place that was going to be in the synagogue. And usually it was facing towards Jerusalem. And then on the right, you have the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. So this is also a story that was used in a lot of Christian spaces, which is the story where Abraham is binding, tying up his son Isaac. God has requested that Isaac be sacrificed. And then at the last moment, you can see that little hand of God at the top. Let's see if I can point to it. Right up here. That's the hand of God at the last moment, halting the sacrifice from happening and saying, no, actually, here you can see that the ram is tied up. Sacrifice this ram instead. And so this is a narrative that we're going to see repeated and repeated, but again, because it can be associated with other religions, it can be associated with Christianity, they're not going to rely on that one as much. So we're going to switch to synagogues now that have these really interesting mosaic carpets, we call them, the mosaic floor. I really like this image because you can see in situ where it's located. You can see it's overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And this one is the synagogue of Hamat Tiberias. It's in Tiberia, and it is where there were originally these hot springs. So I'll go to the individual floors. Here's what you can see what it looks like today. It's still very open air. And of course, they look a little bit more dull in the real life pictures compared to the published ones, because in order to get them to look crisp, you have to throw water on them, and you just can't do that when you go visit these places. But here we can see the implements again of the temple, of the second temple, and of the Jewish people that are being repeated here. So we have the two menorot, the menorahs that are on either side of that tabernacle space. And then we also have, here is the lulav etrog that represents Sukkot. And we also have offerings here. So this would have been an incense shovel. And that is considered a form of sacrifice. Because if you're burning incense, you're burning frankincense, these are things that are very expensive. This is considered sacrificial. And also another piece that is associated specifically with the Jewish religion is the shofar, which is the ram's horn that is blown on holidays. Here's the center, and I want to focus in on this for a moment because there is no consensus about why we have these zodiacs, why we have Helios at the center. There are a dozen theories about why. No one can come to a conclusion, but everyone might be a little partially right. Some people have said, maybe they actually thought it was God or it was representing God. Jody Magnus has said maybe actually this was a representation of the Metatron. It could have been that they actually worshipped Helios, which is what I am inclined to believe. I'm inclined to believe that there were magical practices that were going on in and around the synagogue in everyday life in these temple spaces, and that combined with prognostication or trying to see the future, especially using your horoscope, trying to control the stars or the celestial planets. And so this brings me to the shape of this mosaic. You'll notice that most of these synagogues are in the shape of a basilica. So they're in the shape of a rectangle. And yet at the center, we have a circle. So why the circle? And this is mirroring a lot of Christian spaces as well. Although in Christian spaces, when they have a circle, theirs usually is a dome that they have that is above. Whereas these spaces, usually there wasn't a lot of funding for it, and they just had thatched roofs. But it was a form of mimesis. It was this idea that this circle right here would be a central focal point where the heavens and the earth could be connected with each other. And this was it was understood at this time for Christians and for Jews that whatever was happening on earth was also being mimicked in heaven. So particularly in the liturgy. So when you are going to church or you're going to synagogue and you're doing the rites, timing is very important, because the same time that you are doing the rituals here, the same time you're doing the liturgy on earth, right underneath this, what would have been a dome, the angels are doing it at the same time. And if you're even late by a minute, that means you're making the angels wait. And we can see this even still today in the way we pray. So the movements that Jews make by putting our feet together, and the way we face right, left, we go up on our toes, the movements that we make, this is because the angels supposedly only had one leg. And we don't want to make them feel left out. So we have to pretend we don't have knees, and that's the movements that we make. This is a form of embodied knowledge that still continues to this day. So I'll do some close-ups of the zodiac so that you can see them. And in this case, some of the figures are nude and they are uncircumcised. So this is one of those instances where there were challenges, like, how could Jews allow this type of thing in this space? But we know that the artists might not necessarily have been Jewish, that the artists were being, they were creating works throughout the area, and so that might have been it. Maybe the artists themselves were not Jewish, but they were creating works using Hebrew words, using Aramaic, using a lot of Greek. And you can see in the corners we have these personifications of the seasons. So we have the zodiac, and we have then the seasons are in each corner, and usually they'll be depicted with implements. Are we doing a harvest during that time? These are the implements for that harvest, and then with some of the produce that's being produced at the time. This is the most recent synagogue that was discovered. I am in so much awe of the person who discovered it. Magnus, you can see it's right here in the center. This is looking down from it. And unfortunately, it is missing the one section right here where we would have seen what Helios looked like, but we can see that this quadriga, which is the 4 horses that are leading the chariot, are there along with the rays of the sun, the moon, and stars. So we know that Helios was being depicted here. And again, we have the 12 symbols of the zodiac. And we'll note this one, and also in the next mosaic, that we have winged personifications of the seasons. So again, we really want to be tempted to think of them as angels, but in polytheist mosaics, they also often used personifications of seasons that were winged, or also of the winds and things like that. So we might not necessarily be able to jump to conclusions. The next one is Bet Alpha. So this is another synagogue that's in northern Israel. In this case, we can see that we have, again, Helios in the center. We have the zodiac, and we also have personifications. And these personifications also seem to have wings as well. But something that someone has pointed out about thinking about whether these might have been used as a calendar or for calendric thinking, is that about half of the mosaics are incorrect as far as maybe the personifications of the seasons don't match with the season that's supposed to be going on with the zodiac. So this is one of those instances where we can't necessarily think that this was used as a strict calendar, maybe just as a guide. And then here you can see there are, again, the temple implements. We have the menorot, we have the lulav and etrog for Sukkot, we have the shofar, we have the incense shovels, and then in this case it looks like we also have curtains that are being drawn, maybe to cover up that niche where we had the Torah scrolls. And here we come to the binding of Isaac again. So this is another depiction of it, again with the hand of God, and also with the ram here. And I'd like to point out a comparison between this depiction that we've seen already a couple times and a piyut. A piyut is a poem. It's a liturgical poem that is written specifically for reciting or performing, singing during the liturgy. And we have a great many of these that are available. And so I'll point out that in one instance of this, from several different piyutim, from several different poems, they have the same commentary of the story of the binding of Isaac. And it says, "Before Isaac grew up, you tested Abraham, when you said to him, offer him before me as a burnt offering. And your angels became agitated when they saw him bound. When he arose to slaughter him, they all cried out, 'So shall your descendants be,' is how you blessed his father. And if this one is slaughtered, how can it be a blessing? So you decided to spare him from the fire and the knife, and you saved his offering." And this idea came from these liturgical poems that have said that at one point, God had told Abraham that your descendants will be as many in number as the stars. And so there is this dependence at this time on angels, where the angels were the ones who actually were the intercessor between Abraham and God. They were the ones who swooped in. They became agitated, they pulled out their hair, and they said, "Wait, how can this come to be? You promised him as numerous as the stars would be his offspring." So here is the interior. I always want to give you a few pictures that are not in books, because I feel like you can always look at the ones online, but to see what they actually look like, I think is kind of a gift for anyone who can't actually fly there. And this is the one that, this is the largest mosaic floor. It has the most number of narrative scenes that are in it. This was at the Sephra Synagogue, or Tzipori, and this was a location that had a thriving Jewish community. So this was the one that was discovered right before Hukok. You can see here is what it looks like if you are standing in the apse. You would be coming in from the opposite end from here, and this was a very well-loved, well-worn mosaic carpet. You can see here where there are actually pieces that had been replaced, where some of the floor mosaic had been worn off, and so it needed to just put pottery shards in there so that it could continue to be used. Here is an image where you can see some of the details. A really, really gorgeous carpet. And again, kind of this idea of multicultural. In all of these synagogues, we have so many different languages that are being used. In this one, you can see here the Greek, the Jewish Aramaic, the Hebrew, that are all happening in one place. And from all of these texts, we're able to read dedicatory inscriptions, basically donors who are donating money for a specific carpet, or maybe even just donating money for the synagogue to get built, are honored in the text. Okay, so here is the entire scene, which I'll go through from the bottom. So here we have the angels at Mamre. So this probably, we're not sure that this is what it is, but we can assume so. And this actually would have been a place where we could see what Jews thought angels look like. And that part's, of course, the part that is lost. Of course, that's the one that we can't see. But we do have some Christian examples, and so we'll come to that next to see what it might have looked like there. Oops, sorry, wrong way. And then moving up, You can see that we also have a version of the binding of Isaac. Here are the servants that accompanied Abraham, and you can see here is where that ram is tethered. We're missing the juicy tidbits of it, but here is the center of the mosaic. And here again, this one is interesting because it's an aniconic version of the Helios deity, so we don't have him represented as a man. Instead, he's just represented as this orb. But we do know that it was him because we have that quadriga. Those 4 horses were the ones that in that chariot every morning would drag the sun across the sky. And again, the personifications of the seasons. Here is what the mosaic looked like in situ before it was repaired. And now we get into sacrifices. We have all of these implements represent sacrifices. So we have the first fruits. These are tithing. Before you would before you could eat fruit, you had to tithe some fruit. And you have the showbread table in the center. These are 12 loaves that represent the 12 tribes of Israel that were also for a sacrifice. And more sacrificial implements here that leads up to the main sacrifice, which is of Aaron at the temple. And again, we're missing part of it. We can assume this is him, that he is leading the animals to sacrifice. Here is the ritual cleansing that he would use. And also, as we get closer towards the apse, we can see again the menorot, lulav, etrog, and the shofar. So here is from the historian Josephus when he is describing what it was like to enter the temple. When any persons entered into the temple, its floor received them. The 7 lamps of the menorah signified the 7 planets. So for many there were springing out of the candlestick. The 12 loaves that were upon the showbread table signified the circle of the zodiac and the year. So from very early on, we have an association of these spaces together with the idea of the heavens and the zodiac. So in comparison to Christian spaces, sorry, there's like a cold breeze coming in. So the missing panel that we had in Sepphoris that probably would have showed this scene, this is the angels at Mamre. So this is when the angels came down, they visited Abraham, and they told him and his wife that you will become pregnant. So maybe we can assume that the angels would have looked something like this. We can see from the top of it that this looks very similar, and this is how the binding of Isaac was depicted. And again, we have that hand of God that's coming in. Certainly between these two religions, they are relying on each other for a lot of this visual language. And this is clear in this example of a necropolis, catacombs in Rome, where we have a depiction of Christ. We assume there has been some contention, but it seems to be very clearly a Christian space where Christ is depicted as Helios. He's clean-shaven. He clearly has the quadriga that he is guiding across the sky with the sun. And so it's not just that Jews are using this at the center of their synagogues. We also have Christians who are using this in their spaces, maybe not necessarily of worship. This is where burials would have happened, but as representations for them also. So the reason that we are able to identify this as Christ as Helios, the Helios part is obvious. The Christ part is in the rest of this space. There are other depictions, such as Jonah in the whale and the Good Shepherd carrying the lamb. So things that are often associated with Christian iconography. We don't really have any other examples that are closely related to those Jewish synagogues except for this one. So this is in a monastery that is in Bet Sha'an. It is close actually to a synagogue at Bet She'an, and you can see that maybe not necessarily the same. We don't have just Helios in the center, we have Helios and Selene. But maybe similar enough that there were more Christian spaces, we just haven't discovered them yet. I want to mention just really quickly how there might have been other ways that there was influence between Judaism and Christianity, because I think that one thing we don't often realize that might have happened is in the synagogues that we are all looking at, we don't really find good division of space. So we don't find ways that maybe someone who, if you were trying to divide based on gender, you could say, you know, this is where the women sit and then this is where the men sit. That was something that was happening in Christian churches. So this might have been a development later on that Jewish spaces were mirroring that. But at the time, we have lots of inscriptions that relate to women who were in power, women who obviously had a lot of money that they could spend in the synagogue, and women who, if they weren't able to traverse all parts of the synagogue, you know, why would they have an inscription there? I want to talk for just a moment about aniconism and iconoclasm, because I mentioned that it was up until the discovery of these synagogues that we thought that Jewish art was aniconic. So aniconic, again, doesn't have images. And where did this idea come from? Well, we found it referred to the strict adherence to the second commandment. The second commandment says, you don't make any carved images. And it's really like blanket. Like, you don't make anything in the clouds, you don't make anything in the sea, if it's under the water, like, you just don't do anything, any part of it at all. Of course, some rabbis had a lot to say about this. For instance, Gamaliel, he one time was in a bathhouse bathing, and a polytheist approached him and said, how can you be in here when you have this Aphrodite sculpture that is right here? And he explained it as, I came not within her limits, she came within mine. They do not say, let us make a bath for an Aphrodite. They say, let us make an Aphrodite as an adornment for a bath. Thus, what is treated as a god is forbidden, but what is not treated as god is permitted. And just to show the difference between aniconism and iconoclasm, aniconism means I'm going to create something that just doesn't have a figurative image. Iconoclasm is I'm going to break everything that I disagree with that has an image. So here's an example of aniconism in Judaic art where we have no figurative images that are being carved here. And here's another instance. This is another synagogue, and interestingly, this one at Ein Gedi has a calendar, has the zodiac cycle, and discusses Helios in here, and yet they decided to do it without any figurative images, which is really interesting considering this is the only one that's like it. And the idea might have been here that maybe the written word was actually more powerful than the images that were being represented. So maybe this is a form that was actually stronger, again, more powerful than if we just had the zodiac figures. Here's an instance of iconoclasm. So this is where you can see that the grapes didn't really, they look like they're in okay condition, but then the cherubim there that were making the grapes into wine have been removed. And again, we don't know if this, because this is so long ago, we don't know if it was Jews who necessarily did this, if they at some point felt iconoclastic, or if it was someone else. But we see this kind of, I don't want to say damage, but this alteration that's been happening. For this case, in this instance, this is the synagogue at Na'aran. And you can see that in some cases, incredible care was taken to make sure that only the tesserae that were for this specific area were being removed. And we don't know why some were okay, why the fishies weren't okay, but the crab was okay. And then even looking at the text part, it's a little bit unclear. Were there parts of the tesserae that were scraped off? Were they pushed further in? But in any case, this is a form of iconoclastic display. These are other scenes that are from Dura Europos where we have something that is very similar, where in this case, just the eyes have been poked out. This happens a lot of times in iconoclasm where when you don't want to destroy the whole image, you just need to nullify its power. You want to take away its power, and the eyes are the key to the soul. As long as you damage the eyes, you're pretty much fine. That's all you need to do. I want to talk just briefly a little bit about magic. Magic going on in and around the synagogue and also just within the Jewish community. There are two types: sympathetic, contagion. Sympathetic is, I'm going to draw a picture, and then whatever I draw is going to come true, I hope. And then contagion, this is something that's holy, this is a relic, and then because I am close to this, because of the physical proximity, that's where I'm going to gain the power. And that's what we saw often in synagogues, where we have a very holy place. I can put something next to it, and I'm going to absorb that power. And this was actually such an issue in synagogues that we had John Chrysostom, who had to tell his congregants in the Christian church, I need you guys to just stay away from the synagogues. He says, basically, okay, yes, they have their incantations, their amulets, their charms, their spells. Maybe they'll take away your fevers, their hurts, but you shouldn't be doing this. You need to, on pain of death, let the fever take your life. Don't go to the synagogue. Don't be getting your cures from them. And he mentions even more times than what I've posted here, he repeatedly says the synagogue, that Christians are going to the synagogue for these cures, because Jews were known at the time for having this magic. If you wanted someone to fall in love with you, or if your child was sick, that was where you could go for these spells. So it's interesting that it seems that he's not telling someone don't approach a Jew in the marketplace and ask for these amulets. He's specifically saying don't go to the synagogue for them. I will briefly mention the Sotah ritual because I wanted to mention a ritual that seems like it would actually be happening in the synagogue. So this is a biblical text. It's from Numbers, and basically what it is it's trial by ordeal. So you think your wife's cheated on you. Happens to us all. What do? You go to the temple, you go to the synagogue, and there a priest will mix her up a potion with some of the dust from the floor. Some of the text will be sprinkled in, maybe some bitter herbs, some esoteric names will be said, some sounds like a spell will be said over that potion, and then she will drink the potion. And that's how you will tell. If her womb shrivels and dies, she cheated on you. And it might not happen right away. I mean, it could be years, so you might have to wait a little while. But if she didn't cheat on you and, nothing will happen, and in fact, actually, it will be beneficial for her. She'll actually have more children because of it. And we have many instances of this. The Sotah ritual was repeated in a lot of different texts. We don't know if it actually happened, if this was actually something that was practiced, but what's really interesting is this idea of where it would have been practiced. Because where other place than the synagogue? Where are you going to get the dust that has to be from the synagogue floor? And where are you going to get the priest that has to say all of the magic spells? Only the synagogue. So I would say that whether it happened or not, that was the location where this was happening. Which relates also to magic spell books. We have a lot of magic spell books in Hebrew. We have so many pages of them. We have them copied into different languages. We have them copied over and over again. So these handbooks for sorcerers, magicians, whatever you want to call it, I don't differentiate between magical practice and ritual because I think it would be too hard to try to differentiate, especially when so much of these magical practices are really relying on the language of the liturgy, relying on biblical texts, relying on rabbinic texts in order to make them powerful. So here we have a really popular one. The one on the left is the Sefer HaRatzim, and that is the one where angels are going to give you the secret names of other angels that you can bind to make them do your will. And specifically in this example, it tells us this genealogy that has happened. And we see the genealogy keeps coming up. Genealogy was something also that came up in the Ein Gedi synagogue, the one that has all of the text instead of having the zodiac at the center, that makes a clear line from Adam to current Jewish communities. So that idea of legacy that they're leaning on, of, look, our people have this line. Again, possibly because they are thinking of how Christians are now trying to take that legacy and implement that as part of their own history. And I want to point out a few examples that were found in and near synagogues, because again, I feel that these magical practices were not, as they were not just happening outside, but also happening in and around the synagogue, is really important. So this one is one with, it's on pottery sherds, an example. We also have many amulets that are being found, amulets in apses of synagogues, which especially in instances where we have found a cache or multiple amulets. This is where the idea of contagion comes in. So if you have an amulet, you really want your child to get better, you really want that love potion to work, how are you going to give it power? You're going to put it in the most powerful location you know of. What is that most powerful location? It's going to be in the synagogue where the Torah scrolls are being kept. Something similar I'll point out is from the Dura Europa synagogue that we looked at before. This one is a depiction of an evil eye that was in a ceiling tile. And here we also have an instance where we can see how important text was. So this IAO at the top, this is supposed to be it's a vocalization of the Tetragrammaton. So it's here. It is the Hebrew word for God, but since it is taboo to utter it, that's where often there are a dozen words like Adonai that we use in place of speaking an unutterable name. And this is often something that's going to come up a lot in these magical texts, in these amulets. Sometimes the Hebrew doesn't even make sense. Sometimes you can tell that people just felt that Hebrew was really important, and if they just put it into the spell, it will give it power. Here are other examples of amulets. So these would be these tiny little metal pieces that you could write the spell on and then roll it up and place it where you need to get power. I like this one because it was actually found at Sepphoris. That was the mosaic that we saw, the really big one that had a lot of narratives. And in this case, what's interesting is it doesn't have a specific name of who it's for, which usually names are very important, and usually the name of the person is also important and very easy to write. But this is probably an instance where we had amulets that were being mass produced. So there was such a desire, a trade for amulets, that they could actually be prepared many ahead of time, and then you could probably switch out like, oh, I have this section of amulets here that is just for fevers. Please feel free. And I'll also relate it back to the idea of those, the poetry. The poetry that I mentioned, we saw the piyut, the liturgy poem before that was describing the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. We have so many instances where these liturgical poems relate and use language so close to what we find in the magical texts. The Sefer HaRatzim, in other ways for blessing, for curses. that you really can't separate them. It's like a chicken or the egg of what came first and how were they being used. And then the last part of magic that we'll talk about is incantation bowls. So these are a dime a dozen. We have so many instances of these. We have hundreds of them. Usually they are written with the spell that you want, the demon in the center that you want to bind, that you want to make do your will, and then they were placed upside down near the house that you wanted to protect, or the girl that you were trying to attract her attention. You would put the bowl, or you could also put your amulets at her door. Maybe on the outside of her house, you'd sneak to her house and you'd bury the bowl there. And in a lot of the same ways, we see this relating to how amulets could have been used also in the synagogue. Why are we finding them in synagogues? Why are we finding them on the outside of synagogues? And again, it's that feeling of contagion. This one is another example. And I'm going to wrap up just by going back to that the center mosaics that have Helios on them. I'll go back to the magical text, the Sefer HaRatzim. That one is the guidebook for someone who wants to gain the powers of the universe. And the spell in there that is the most powerful spell, the one that is accompanied by lightning and thunder, that you have to be weary of because Helios will show himself. You're going to have to prostrate yourself. The spell tells you exactly how you need to bow and how you have to honor the deity that's going to come before you, because he's going to be scary, and it even warns you, do not be afraid when you see him. So when you call for him in this text, it says, in the name of the Holy King, the ruler of the planets, stars, and fate, and the sun and the moon, that I may see the sun in his power, in the celestial circle traversed by his chariot. Tell me the secret of the depths, and make known to me hidden things. Holy Helios, who rises in the east, good mariner, trustworthy leader of the sun's rays, reliable witness, who of old didst establish the mighty wheel of the heavens, holy orderer, ruler of the axis of the heavens. So in this case, all of these theories that we have about what this space is, what this space did, how it functioned, and I just can't help but going back to how many spells there are that call upon Helios, that ask for his intervention, that ask for him as an intercessor, him or the angels. When compared with God Almighty, who would sacrifice his son, you need someone in between. And the Christian spaces, they had Christ and they had the Virgin that you could go to and you could plead your case. And in this instance, we have someone else who is ordering the heavens. And the ordering of the heavens was so important for Jews at this time, because everything that they were doing was wrapped up in agriculture, was wrapped up in the calendar. There was a lot of contention in this time of what calendar should be used. Should it be solar? Should it be lunar? Should it be solar lunar? You know, how do we navigate having the correct liturgy at the correct time so that we're not making the angels wait on us, so that we're not doing something wrong? So I tend to think that these central mosaics act as almost a mnemonic device. They are this instance where congregants can look at this and remember, well, we don't have other ways to prognosticate anymore. Like with the temple, they had the Urim and the Thummim, which were casting lots. They could cast lots to see what was going to happen in the future. Now they don't have that. Now they have the horoscope. They have these spell books and amulets and pottery sherds that they can use to try to control the world around them. And why not plead their case to, the actual personification for them of the sun, the one that they believed was actually dragging the sun across the sky every day? Thank you guys so much for listening to this talk. in the back.
So my question was about the worship of Helios.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking just after you were talking about what's happening on earth is also happening in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any connection to the sun which sustains life here to worship of the thing in heaven which sustains all life? Is that any idea that
We have magical texts where the worshiper can talk directly to the sun and moon as if they were people. I'm not recalling right now anything that would be specifically in the synagogue that would be a worship directly like what you're saying. More just in magical handbooks and texts. For instance, clearly there are a lot of love spells. I keep referencing them. But if you wanted someone to fall in love with you, in the Sefer HaHatzim, you didn't ask for the person to fall in love with you. You asked for the stars to be changed. You asked for the heavens to rearrange themselves, the sun, the moon, the stars, so that now your stars could be aligned, because that was the surer way for her to fall in love with you than just by asking for it. So it's not directly like what you're saying, or at least there aren't examples that I can think of. Yeah.
I didn't get a sense of when does Helios, the image, start entering Jewish worship spaces? Can you give me a rough date on when that starts to happen?
Yeah, so I want to say was Tiberius the first one, and that one was, oh, I have it on there. I want to say 3rd century. Sorry, it's literally in the slide. I don't remember dates because my head just can't be filled up with all of them.
That's the side of true history. Numbers, we do mathematicians.
And actually, Tiberius is one where there is some contention over when it was in use, because there's the 3rd century synagogue that is kind of on the side of it, but this one we think is 4th century.
When do they start filtering, at some point, 130 or so, they were more or less kicked out of at least the area around Jerusalem?
Mm-hmm.
When did they start filtering back?
I don't want to say that they ever left. I mean, the priests and the priestly families, they did sort of scatter to the winds, and they were still very influential in their own, in their own communities. But I mean, even from the map, you can see how. I mean, this one doesn't show the diaspora, but we really got centered around the Sea of Galilee. That's where we're just finding so many of these spaces.
So if anything, dedication that Jerusalem might have been just going up as far as Galilee.
Yeah, I mean, Tzipoli was a really big community that, there was a really big Jewish community, but in all of these spaces, the Dura Europos, in Sepphoris, it is not exclusively Jews. It is Jews, and they are living right next door to polytheists, right next door to Christians. Mm-hmm.
Is Architect art and usually Jewish religious art?
No, actually not at all. And in this case, they're very Hellenized, so that means that they were looking at Greco-Roman examples. So in all of these synagogue mosaics that you see, you can just Google Greco-Roman examples, and you will find so many. There are so many mosaic floors, mosaic carpets that have actually very similar imagery. Mm-hmm.
I was seeing a lot of pictures of basically the seasons and the months. Was it all in one location, or was it in different locations?
Usually the seasons were around those spandrels in the corners where you had the zodiac, and then in those little corners were the personifications of the ceilings, at least in the synagogue spaces.
So was it like always
Mm-hmm.
winter, all like in specific corners, or could it be whichever way you want?
It was really jumbled, and that's what kind of fights against the idea that these were just used as a strict calendar or for calendric reckoning, because if that was the case, it would need to be accurate. And if you're spending so much money to have someone cut all of these tiny little squares of stone and place them there, you would think you'd get it right, but half of these mosaic floors, and we have 8 zodiac floors, half of them are incorrect, where the season won't match with where they're supposed to be. And so, yeah, they are kind of jumbled. Did that answer it? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Because in those special locations, I believe also has like a clock, correct?
Oh, a clock? Oh, sorry?
It has to be in a specific area
Mm-hmm.
to the time like the ancient times when they kept time, right?
Wait, sorry, I didn't understand.
The ancient times they kept time.
With the sun and the sundial,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, we had sundials,
So
yes.
does it align at all?
Oh, no, they do not. No, they don't align with the sundial. We do have instances where we can see that throughout the day the sun would cross in different ways across the floor, but we can't find any mechanism that would be used for time reckoning. Was there a question back here?
Well, since the Torah actually prohibits sorcery and witchcraft in a number of places,
Mm-hmm.
do you think it's possible that some of this, I don't know what you would call it, sorcery or whatever, that maybe was more polytheistic and not authentically Jewish?
I would really push back on that because, one, even though we have so many instances, biblical texts that are saying it's not okay, we do have the Sotah ritual, which is in the Bible, but as far as rabbinic texts, we have so many rabbis who were using magic, using it like so much so in their everyday lives that they didn't even think twice about discussing it. One rabbi was able to make cucumbers grow as many as he wanted in his field, and then the cucumbers would pick themselves. Another rabbi, 2 rabbis were on a ship, and a polytheist said a magic word because she became angry with them. It stopped the ship, but it was okay because they knew the magic counterspell that they could say to counteract that spell, and the ship could go again. There was another instance where when the rabbis were arguing about how much cloth or vellum were you able to carry into the synagogue on Shabbat, because that's another instance of of carrying laws. And while they were arguing it, one rabbi said, well, just enough that you can cover an amulet. And everyone in the room knew, aha, okay, we know what an amulet is, and we all wear amulets, and we take them with us on Shabbat, so that is how much it would be.
So there were different groups of Jewish people, some of them more religious than others. And in fact, the Christians were originally under the Jewish umbrella, who later moved away and broke off from Judaism, because some of the teachings that I've learned, it says that there shall not be found among you a soothsayer, a diviner of auspicious times, one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer. Whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. So again, my understanding and practice is that religious Jews don't believe and are not, and certainly don't practice any witchcraft, or because that would assume that there was an alternative power to the one God who created the heavens and the earth. So Jewish people believe in God being one. And so if there's some force, call it what you want, sorcery, witchcraft, who knows what, call it what you will, that's not the creator of the world as taught in Judaism.
I think there.
So to practice that is in and of itself not Jewish. It's polytheism. I don't want to put even a label on it because I wasn't alive then. I don't know what you call it, but it's not what Jews believe, which is only a belief in the one who created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh.
And so I think in relation to that one, so terms like witchcraft. So we saw that was something that John Chrysostom, so who was a Christian pastor, he was using that term to describe the Jews. But I don't think that the Jews would have used that to describe themselves because, they wouldn't have used that.
I don't think they would describe themselves as witches.
No, and I haven't found anything like that. But we do have, for instance, the biblical use of the Urim and the Thummim.
Yes, and I think she's trying to explain the difference that you're having here.
So for instance, like what I mentioned, the Urim and the Thummim, so that was something that was actually so important for prognostication, for soothsaying, for telling the future by using the bones and casting lots to see what would happen, that it was actually placed on Aaron's breastplate so that he could keep it with him. So I think that, yes, when we have very different biblical instances. Like, I don't think that anyone would argue that the Sotah ritual, which is in the Bible, is not a form of magic, of magical practice, unless we just can't differentiate between ritual and magic, because we have a potion, we have an incantation.
Well, I would differentiate between ritual and magic.
Mm-hmm.
I would, because ritual is something you do to connect with the Creator, with God, whatever word you use for the higher power that's created the world. So ritual, you're trying to connect. And magic, you're trying to make whatever God would do, something, you're trying to change it. So you're trying to be a separate power. And that's just not the Judaism that I understand and live.
And I think
we're taught that we're not polytheistic.
No, of course. And there are also many instances in these magical texts using Hebrew that are saying we are going to harness the power of God, we're going to harness the power of angels, the angels that are in the different firmaments. And so, in this case, I think it could be a difference of opinion with...
Just like there's many cultures that speak English.
And I think, having a modern day conception on something that happened so long ago is very difficult.
I got a question.
Yeah, sure.
When you go back to the seasons, they said that 4 of them were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a prevailing theory why that happened? Why they were doing that?
We don't know why they're
Is it by
wrong.
region? I mean, is it when you look at that map? Is it by region? Something that might be.
No, they're
So
just really.
They
It's
just look
so,
at it. Nobody knows.
It's so random.
It was on eBay.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one thing. I mean, sometimes when we look at, for instance, the synagogue at Bet Alpha, there's an inscription in here that says that the artists were paid in kind with agricultural goods. So they weren't paid in money. They, here's some food. And sometimes I've wondered when my 5 or 7-year-old come to me with a drawing, and I look at it and I say, oh my gosh, I have discovered it. This is what this synagogue mosaic must have been based on, because if you look at it, it does have a very amateurish feel to it. So it could have been that. It seems really interesting that some of these where so much money was put into it, seemingly to build it, so much time, that why wouldn't they get it exactly right? Okay.
I'm sure Rachel will be happy to talk to people now that we're done, but thank you again so much.
Thank you.